Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, the Parliamentary Committee of Canadian Heritage is studying systemic racism and racial discrimination. And in the first hour, from 3:30 to 4:30, we have three witnesses. The Armenian National Committee of Canada, who I think is on the video conferencing, Trinity Western University on video conferencing, and of course Dr. Zuhdi Jasser from Phoenix, Arizona, who is here. Other way around? Oh, Robert Kuhn is here. Okay, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so now we will begin. Here's the protocols. You have 10 minutes to present your position, and after that there will be a question and answer. At 8 minutes, I will give you a 2-minute warning that you may have to wrap up. I now go to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser for 10 minutes, and I'll give you an 8-minute warning. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairwoman Fry and members of the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage for holding this important hearing, and thank you for inviting me. I can't tell you enough how important this issue is to me. And for those of us south of your border, America has been wrestling with many of these same issues since 9/11, as your country has. I'm founder and president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy. As you mentioned, my name is Zuhdi Jasser. I'm also the son of Syrian immigrants. My family escaped the Ba'ath regime in Syria in the mid-60s, and I still have most of my family still in Syria, so I'm greatly aware of the plight of refugees and our families. What I'm going to reference today, in the little time I have with you, I've submitted my full comments for your record, and I ask you to accept those. But really the unintended consequences of M103. It may be intended well to prevent bigotry against Muslims, but since it's couched in the terms Islamophobia, since it really looks at Muslims as a monolith, I think it would cause more harm than good. And I'm going to walk you through what I see as some of its harms and what I think would be a better approach to the issues that were intended to be raised in M103. As a devout Muslim, an American Muslim who loves my faith and loves my country, I must tell you that any emphasis on Islamophobia, as it's called, is profoundly flawed and will continue our nations down the slippery slope of actually catering to Islamist separatism. I'm here to tell you that simply even using that term Islamophobia and getting the government into the business of monitoring any form of speech will end up paradoxically heightening societal divisions. We must not coddle our Muslim communities, which will only further separate Muslims out. We must treat them as any other minority, any other grievance group, and group that needs protection from civil rights. But trying to suppress what can be painful speech about Islam at society's fringes will actually paradoxically feed an unintended consequence of fomenting non-Muslim fears of Islam. Citizens who cannot have their real fears heard and their speech exercised will be stifled from the public sector and pushed underground, resentment that will only foment and actually exacerbate the very problem M103 claims to want to solve. Let me tell you a little bit briefly about our organization. We were founded in the wake of 9/11 to separate mosque and state. We believe that the only way to defeat the root cause of radical Islam is to defeat the ideology, nonviolent ideology of political Islam or Islamic State identity movements. We also helped found the Muslim Reform Movement that was founded in December 2015, and we have members across the US, Canada, and Europe, including Rahil Raza, who I believe has spoken to your committee before me. We are reformists, and I want to emphasize this movement because much of what we say on behalf of liberal rights, liberal ideas, women's rights, minority rights within Muslims is often identified as blasphemy by Islamic regimes, is identified as heretical by mosques in the West, and identified as quote-unquote Islamophobic by mosques and leaders in the West, including many allies of the author of M103. So I would tell you that Islamophobia is a weapon used by theocrats to prevent free speech, to prevent critical thinking and modernization of the very ideas that create the underbelly of radical Islam, if you will. And by having a resolution and having a sentiment put forth that focuses on, rather than bigotry that surely exists against minorities, and I'm not telling you that there isn't bigotry that exists against Muslims, against Jews, against other minorities in all of our societies that we need to fight. But by calling it Islamophobia, you're basically implying that Islam has rights. Islam is an idea, like any faith. It does not have rights. It's not a race, and it's not part of this systemic racism and discrimination that is being addressed by M103. So I would tell you that the way to approach it, just as you approach anti-Semitism, you don't approach Judeophobia, you approach anti-Semitism because bigotry exists against practitioners of the Jewish faith that needs to be defeated. And ultimately, bigotry exists against Muslims that needs to be defeated, but we don't do it by making people afraid to push the issues that need reform and need to be addressed, because the primary victims of, even in the West, our government's addressing quote-unquote Islamophobia and calling it that, is going to be Muslims. So where it asks you to address and quell increasing climate of hate and fear, I believe it'll actually make it worse, preventing the tough conversations we need to have. Where it asks you to condemn Islamophobia and all forms of racism and religious discrimination and take note of E411, I would tell you that the language of E411 actually smacks of a lot of the language of theocracies from Iran to Saudi Arabia and others, and that it'll actually only empower tribal leaders and Islamists within our community. Next, M103 asks you to undertake a study of how the government should develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism. I would say certainly that the government should be in the business of protecting individual citizens from hate and racism, but it should not be in the business of studying negative and positive sentiments about a particular faith or idea. And then it asks you to collect data about hate and crime reports. Again, that seems harmless enough, but the focus should not simply be Muslims, but actually all minorities and all people of faith, because when you carve out Muslims, it actually feeds into the separatism. So the harms of M103, I believe, include enabling and enshrining the term Islamophobia with the empowerment of all the Islamists domestically and abroad, which marginalizes us reformers that are dedicated to working with both liberals and conservatives in protecting the rights of women, protecting the rights of apostates and blasphemers and others that Islamists don't want to give freedom of speech to. M103 will empower Islamists over Muslim reformers and actually call us Islamophobes. I believe it infantilizes Muslims by disproportionately protecting them more than any other vulnerable minority or community in Canada. And I think it will backfire and end up separating Muslims out more and feeding to both extremes, those who are too ignorant of the realities within Muslim communities, and those who actually might be blaming all of Islam for the acts of radicals. M103 treats Muslims as a monolith, and I think that is not healthy. And most importantly, I think that this mantra, this language, will feed into harming the progress in the security apparatus. In my recommendations, one of my primary recommendations to you is that you recommend to your government that you shift from CVE, countering violent extremism, to countering violent Islamism. Because we Muslims can only help you counter the radical ideologies of Wahhabism, Salafi jihadism, and all these things that our governments have not wanted to dive into, and shift away from a whack-a-mole program in national security to actually working against the ideas that radicalize Muslims within our community, such as the horrendous misogyny, the anti-Semitism, and other things preached from the pulpits that actually radicalize and are the precursors to push Muslims down that pathway of radicalization. I think that these conversations will not be able to be had if M103 is implemented that talks about Islamophobia, because then they will say any discussion of Islamism or political Islam, which is theocratic Islam, which I think every American could understand, which is our country was founded on fighting theocracy, and I think the West understands this battle. It's just that Islam is a few hundred years behind, being only in our 15th century. So my recommendations to you are to, number one, address any bigotry and racism equally across faith and racial communities without a disproportionate focus on Muslims. Second, do not use the term Islamophobia. Please do not use it. Third, the best way to melt away any bigotry that exists against Muslims is to have us given platforms to counter jihadism and counter Salafism, so that Canadians can see us leading the battle and how much of an asset we are to countering the threat. And that will actually do so much more to counter this so-called Islamophobia or bigotry, to actually have Canadians see how vital we are. Fourth is to have a whole of government, as it calls for, a whole of government approach to change the language to countering violent Islamism rather than countering violent extremism, and to include a broad spectrum. When you talk about diversity in our community, to include reformists and those who push against the old mantras that have been fossilized in our thought processes. And I would ask the last 2 points as my time ends here, is to stop engaging Muslim Brotherhood legacy groups, and to understand the elephant in the room, which is the OIC governments, the Islamic theocracies across the planet that don't want your people of your country to get into the criticism of theocratic Islam. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much. We now go into the second part of this hearing, which is to have a question and answer segment, and that's going to be, the first round is a 7-minute round. The 7 minutes include questions and answers, so I'm asking everybody to be as crisp and terse as you possibly can. We begin with Mr. Breton for the Liberals.
Oui, alors, bonjour à tous.
So, thank you very much, and hello to everybody here. Thank you for being with us today to help us in our study. My first question is for Mr. Mirakian.
Votre organisation, c'est que, dans le fond, vous êtes un organisme.
Understand about your organization is this: you are a community organization that defends the rights and concerns of the Canadian Armenian community, their human rights as well, at a more public level. My question for you is this: in view of the fact that you are interested in rights and freedoms, how can the Government of Canada better ensure the protection of the rights and freedoms that are guaranteed by the Charter here in Canada?
Thank you, sir. I'm going to respond in English. I'm more familiar with English than French. Very quickly, about 4 years ago now, the Armenian National Committee of Canada had an opportunity to reconsider our mandate, and we spent a long time thinking about it. And rather than being a group that just advocated for the issues of interest to Armenian Canadians, we actually changed our mandate to say we were a grassroots human rights organization that generally advocated for human rights for all people. And one of the reasons for doing that was because in a country like Canada, we recognize that it's very important that we stand up for all the people who are subject to various forms of discrimination, racism, or had their, as you said, charter rights denied. But I think the most, obviously we have a government, we have courts, we have all kinds of functioning to stand up for charter rights. But I think, and certainly I think I sound a little bit, maybe a little airy-fairy or have my head in the clouds, but I certainly think that education and advocacy by individuals and by groups is very important to make sure that we all recognize our charter rights and that we're all ready to defend them as necessary. Obviously, some of them are fairly clear. I don't think that people are going to take away my right to a fair trial or due process without a great outcry, but I think others of them certainly are less clear and require more education and more effort to preserve.
Merci.
Thank you. On April the 3rd, the National Committee, your committee, that also represents the Rwandan communities, Jewish communities, and Ukrainian communities, published a statement. Can you give us more information and explain why that statement was made by your organization last year?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in April of 2015, the House of Commons passed a motion M587, that recognized the month of April as Genocide Remembrance, Condemnation, and Prevention Month. And in April 2016, we were involved in efforts to have the various communities get together to try and recognize that month again. Unfortunately, by the time we were organized, it was a little late. But this year, luckily, we started very early, and all the communities worked together to commemorate that very important motion that passed the House of Commons in April 2015, and to recognize that April in Canada is now designated as Genocide Prevention, Remembrance, and Condemnation Month. And each of the communities there have specifically been the subject of genocidal acts against them that are recognized by the Canadian government. So the Ukrainian, the Holodomor, the Jewish community, the Holocaust, the Rwandan, the genocide in Rwanda, and obviously the Armenian genocide. So we all work together, and I think that's one of the ways in which advocacy groups can work together to overcome divisions between communities. We share a common interest as Canadians and as members of communities to have these things recognized and to prevent such systemic discrimination in the future.
Merci, Monsieur Mirakian.
Rakin. Now, for Mr. Kuhn. I don't really know much about your university, Trinity Western, but I would like, and since you spoke about this, you've seen discrimination towards your university. I didn't fully understand in your presentation of what that was. Can you perhaps go over this again? Are there people in your organization that were targeted by religious discrimination? Am I understanding this correctly?
Yes, there are examples in my written material of graduates from Trinity Western who were, because of their going to a Christian school, were targeted, so to speak. And there's the matter that I referred to in terms of the professor who was duly qualified to apply for a job but was boycotted by the professors union in the university to which that professor applied, and the general more well-known circumstances where the law societies denied the access to Trinity Western School of Law graduates or post School of Law graduates to practice law in those provinces. Those are the three examples I've provided.
OK, mais c'est...
Thank you.
OK, je vais revenir plus tard si je le fais. Merci.
I'll come back later then if I have the time.
Now I go to David Anderson for the Conservatives.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank our witnesses for being with us today. Mr. Jasser, I'd like to start with you. I'm just wondering if you can give us a little bit of information. How do you deal with radical preaching and still leave freedom of speech intact? Do you have any recommendations for us? That we've heard testimony here. We should be limiting freedom of speech, and then others are saying absolutely not. Do you have any comments on that? I only have 7 minutes, so I'll need a quick answer.
Yeah, I would tell you absolutely not. Do not limit it. Every Middle Eastern regime is testimony to the fact that when they limit free speech, they push them underground. They will still preach what they do, and they won't have the antiseptic of sunlight. Just as I don't want my speech prohibited by this false banner of Islamophobia or anyone's criticism of Islam, similarly, the radicals can only be, the light of day can only be shed on them, and we can monitor them if they have the freedom. As long as they're not preaching imminent violence and violence against individuals, our Supreme Court has deemed that that's free speech, even for the KKK. And I think most societies have shown when you limit that speech, you actually radicalize them more.
Thank you. President Kuhn, I'm just wondering if you could tell me, is it fair to force faith institutions to be defined by external sources? I think I know the answer to that question, but is it fair for religious institutions, religious faiths to be defined by external forces and sources?
Very broad question, and I'm not sure that it can be answered in definitive terms without a specific example. in some respects, the organization must be defined by external societal circumstances. In other respects, as I indicated, the duty to accommodate reflects a balancing between the interests of the external regulating entity, whatever that may be, defining entity, and the community, the religious community itself.
Okay, so in 2016, and the Ontario court said that the Law Society of Upper Canada's decision did in fact interfere with PW's right to religious freedom, but that infringement was not unreasonable. I'm just wondering, from your perspective, if we're going to go in that direction, if the courts are going to go in that direction, then what are the limits of reasonableness? Where can they come into either the Christian community, Muslim community, Hindu community, and say, here's the guidelines, you can't go past here with your faith issues?
Of course, there's a significant amount of jurisprudence on this with respect to the balancing of rights under Section 1 of the Charter. The other issue, it does come back to accommodation. There are legal avenues that would afford a balancing of the term reasonable. Reasonable, as with many other terms in the English language, can be much of what you define it to be. Reasonable to one person is not reasonable to another. But there are established principles like that of accommodation, which establish what reasonable means in given circumstances. Certainly, if courts were to make the conclusion that you read from the Ontario decision, as opposed to the one from the British Columbia Court of Appeal, where the issue of a liberalization of societal values generally impinges on the religious views of an organization or a community such as Trinity Western.
Do you feel is this religious discrimination that you're facing, is it systemic, or do you think is it going to become systemic? Our motion talks about systemic discrimination. I'm wondering, from your perspective, is it systemic, or is it not? And if so, is it going in that direction?
I'm of the view that it continues to gain strength in a systemic way because of the way in which multiple aspects of society have now taken up the terminology that is ill-defined, such as inclusivity, which inclusivity, if it doesn't include religious organizations, isn't itself inclusivity, but inclusivity is used in a language that is ill-defined and actually creates a potential for hierarchy of rights and hierarchy of views.
So we had testimony last week from one of our witnesses that basically came to the point of saying that if religious feelings are hurt, that is going too far. So in terms of Islam, that would be Islamophobic. If someone feels that they have been offended, then the person who's offended them is Islamophobic. Do you believe we can take things that far? What is the difference between protecting religious freedom and then protecting religious sentiment? I know in other countries we've got laws protecting religious sentiment that end up in bad place, but do you have any thoughts about that? How do we protect religious freedoms at a time when people's feelings seem to be important as fact?
It's again a balancing act, but I think the law is quite definitive in terms of creating going too far is hate speech, but expression of freedom of speech, as we've had one of the other witnesses testify to, is something. Freedom of speech must be protected at a significant level. So it's a balancing of those concerns. My concern relates to more of a systemic, where the balancing never takes place, because the idea of religious freedom, the idea of religious discrimination, is not taken into account in creating this hierarchy of sort of moral values, be it societal or otherwise. A majoritarian opinion.
I think has a question.
Quick question. Thank you, Chair, and to President Kuhn, you've got some very powerful opposition to your law school that you're proposing at Trinity Western. You've got the 3 law societies. You even have CBIC, one of the biggest banks.
1 minute.
You believe that the diversity of Canada should include Trinity, and do you believe it's just Trinity that they're after, or is it basically religious freedom?
It's my view that the balancing needs to occur not just at a government level, where it's protected to some extent by laws in place. I mean, legal alternatives are only one way in which society can deal with its conflicts between a religious organization or a religious view and societal standards. But there are many other people, including societies or organizations that govern the affairs indirectly or directly, for instance, a bank or other corporate institution that govern the affairs of religious organizations and have the potential to exclude them from the table of pluralism, have the potential to eliminate their voice, have the potential to really to push to the margins those who have religious views that may be not in accordance with the moral or the majority that is expressed through a variety of means, such as you mentioned. So I think
Thank you, Mr. Kuhn.
we're very much in that direction.
Thank you. Now go to Jenny Kwan for the New Democrats.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I thank you to all the speakers on the panel today. I'd like to first, I guess, start by making a clarification, because this comes up almost regularly at these committee meetings, that somehow, because the word Islamophobia is mentioned in this motion, that all that we're dealing with is the issue of Islamophobia, which of course is not true. And the motion itself explicitly states that is Islamophobia and all forms of discrimination. So I just want to put that on the record so that we're clear on what we're talking about and what we're studying here. I'd like to ask my question to Mr. Mirakiran. Did I say that correctly?
Close enough.
Mirakian.
Yes,
All right.
thank you.
Thank you. And I appreciate your comments, and particularly when you indicated that there's an expansion of your organization's work in dealing with issues around human rights for all the different groups. So to that end, we used to, in this country, have a national action plan with respect to dealing with the issue of racism. We don't have that anymore, and I just wonder if you can comment on whether or not from this study, at this point in time in our history, that it is important for us to bring back such a national plan, and if so, what are the components that you would say we ought to focus in on, or that is to say the government should be focusing in on as a means of priorities?
I'm not sure I have necessarily the authority to speak on behalf of my organization on that specific matter of policy, but I will say that one of the most important ways in which we protect human rights and recognize human rights is when they become priorities for government. When something is not a priority of the government, it's very hard to scream into the void, right? And make your voice, try to make your voice heard if you're not getting any response or assistance from the government on these topics. And so one of the most fundamental points is that our groups work to try and make things priorities of the government, not because we somehow think that this is important to us particularly and that we'll somehow, achieve a personal benefit from it, but that it benefits all Canadians when government sets priorities that are important to all Canadians. And these are, for instance, combating racism or systemic religious discrimination or any other violation of human rights across the board. These are important things that governments should demonstrate matter to them. And whether or not that involves, the large spending of money on national action plans, I can't say, or certainly I can't take an organizational view on. I have my personal views on the topic, but I think that we need to make it a priority for the government, especially at the federal level, that these things matter. I think because, especially for most Canadians, when something becomes a federal issue, and this is something that can be a federal issue, the Charter certainly falls within the federal jurisdiction, it's something that people take as a priority amongst ourselves as well.
Thank you. Okay. Now, so you indicate that it's important for the government to take it seriously, and I would agree with that as well, in terms of what kind of action should government take. Now, I ask this just to get a sense from people, how can the government indicate that they are taking this seriously? I would argue that moving forward on the national action plan would be one way, and that would be on both racism and also on religious discrimination. In fact, I would argue on all forms of discrimination. And then, now, on this question, we used to have a Ministry of Multiculturalism in this country. That is no longer the case. And so from that perspective, would that be a showing of government to indicate that this is a priority within government to address the issue of discrimination that we're seeing today in our communities, to bring back a Ministry of Multiculturalism?
I think it's important that all ministries, all government agencies recognize that Canada is diverse. I mean, we recognize certainly, that we have diversity in gender and things of that sort, because it is 2015 or whatever. And similarly, I think it's important to recognize that Canada is a culturally diverse place that has not only our founding peoples and the Indigenous peoples, our First Nations, but also groups that have arrived in Canada often at the same time as the founding peoples, but have their own cultural backgrounds as well. And I think one of the things that I would recommend, and that's something I can speak to, is that we often have, you hear about red tape reduction acts, where the government goes through a lot of legislation and tries to take out things that are outdated or regulations that are wrong. I think we need to have a multiculturalism or a systemic discrimination reduction act one day too, like to go through all of our legislation and remove those pieces that are leftovers of a different time or that don't properly recognize cultural communities. And I think this is a great first step, rather than waiting for dozens and dozens of charter challenges to try and fix things, or having advocacy organizations knocking on our door. If we were to set up a committee that were to go through carefully some of the legislation and policies that we have in place, and some of the mandates of agencies, and try and address some of the roots of systemic discrimination, we would be proactive in getting ahead of the problem. And I think that would make a real difference to people as well. And it wouldn't be nearly as expensive as having, creating all sorts of new ministries. Thank you.
Just to bring that a little bit further then, I think it is important to be sure to look at previous or past legislation through that lens. In fact, in BC, we did that, although the opposition did that, and went through, particularly on the question of discrimination targeted towards the Chinese Canadian community in advance of us making the apology. And we actually came back with volumes of material indicating discriminatory policies and laws that were enacted in BC. So I would agree with that point. Now, to bring it further, should the government then be putting all future policies through that lens as well?
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
You okay?
Second.
And now go to Arif Zavani for the Liberals.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I had a few questions for various witnesses. So I'll start with Mr. Mirakian. So thank you very much for your testimony. And again, just thank you as a person who previously worked with Minister McCallum on the refugee resettlement. Thank you specifically to the Armenian Canadian community for your extensive efforts in assisting with the refugee resettlement over the past couple of years. In terms of community capacity building, I want to pick up a bit where Ms. Kwan was with you as well. In terms of, we've heard a lot about this during the context of this committee study. We've heard about the fact that Heritage Canada at one time in the past did actually fund community capacity building, community development for individual communities unto themselves. Can you give us a bit more, can you flesh out a little bit for the committee why you think this would be useful specifically for the newer communities and newcomer communities that are less established right now in Canada?
Sure. Again, I don't want to make it seem like funding is the solution to every problem, but certainly government has tools that they can offer to communities to create capacity for those communities to set themselves up, to organize themselves as more than just organizations that are organized to preserve their own culture. That is to say that government has to be one of the drivers, whether it's through financial means or just through mentorship or providing that assistance, to create tools for these communities to advocate for their interests with the broader Canadian public and to involve themselves in Canadian society on a multiplicity of issues. To be honest with you, the Armenian community has been established in Canada for over 100 years, and only recently have we moved on from being able to advocate solely for our own interests to be able to advocate for the interests of the broader Canadian public on a multiplicity of issues. And that maturity came about not overnight, but it came out through working on issues such as Syria, but even before, for instance, the Canadian Museum of Human Rights and things of that sort, where we were involved and obtained mentorship from other communities and working together with other groups. And I think government can sort of jumpstart that process by providing the capacity and the tools to do that. One example I would give is that having a permanent employee for a community can make all the difference sometimes, or even a part-time employee for a community, as opposed to being just volunteer-based. And that's something that, for instance, a government grant can make a huge change with. If a community is a newcomer community and people are just struggling to integrate with Canadian society and don't necessarily have the funding. So there's just one suggestion, for instance.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kuhn, I'd like to turn to you, so thank you for being here. Thank you for your testimony. I'll say from the perspective of a person who represents a riding in downtown Toronto, Parkdale High Park, the concerns that get expressed to me about your institution are not so much geared towards religious discrimination as you perceive it, but rather specifically at the covenant itself. Those concerns are expressed to me by United Churchgoers in my riding, who say, we're all in favor of Christianity being protected in the same way that any other religion should be protected, but it's the covenant itself, and then how it connects to the fact that you be producing law graduates who then themselves would be entering into the domain, passing the bar, required to pass the bar course in constitutional law, human rights law, receive clients of different faiths, backgrounds, different sexual orientations, and how that exactly would work. That being said, I think I want to just clarify a couple of things. You said in your recommendations that you believe that there needs to be better understanding of, in consultation with religious groups, there needs to be better understanding of what religious groups are all about and how to accommodate religious groups. Did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay. And that would apply to all religious groups?
Yes.
Okay. And do you think, we've also heard testimony during this committee hearings from different groups talking about the need, particularly when we look at the rise of hate crimes and the rise of hate crimes against religious groups, specifically Jews and Muslims right now, that interfaith dialogue could be a way of building up that dialogue and understanding among groups. Do you think that makes sense?
Yes, I think I've advocated for that in the paper that I submitted, or the brief that I submitted.
Okay. And I've got about 3 minutes and 40 seconds, maybe 2 minutes and 40 seconds. So I'll turn to Mr. Josser. So Mr. Josser, like Ms. Kwan, I just wanted to clarify a few things in terms of that relate to some of your submissions, and then if we can have a comment at the end, that would be terrific. But I'll again confess to you, as somebody who sat here for the last 8 weeks hearing from witnesses, that it strikes me as a little bit odd to indicate that this motion and the committee study we're now doing somehow prevents freedom of expression and free speech when we are entertaining witnesses from all aspects of the spectrum who are themselves participating in a wide and robust dialogue here and challenging a lot of the notions that we are presenting. So from our perspective, a study is encouraging speech rather than chilling it. You mentioned Ms. Raza as somebody who shares your view of the world, so to speak, in terms of somebody you've collaborated with. Ms. Raza has been demonstrated to be somebody who continues to participate on certain social media forums and certain platforms such as the Rebel Media, an entity that has been eschewed by the leader of the official opposition, and yet she maintains that as a platform. And that platform has been identified by other witnesses as a divisive platform in this committee. You've said that you struggle with the idea of what is Islamophobic, and I will say to you that I personally feel we spent a lot of time on this issue about the terminology as opposed to addressing the root cause of the problem. We've heard from a number of people, and I say this to you as a Muslim member of Parliament, that no one feels that we should be having a problem with questioning the tenets of a faith, the same way I could question the tenets of the Hindu faith. People.
How much time is left, Madam Chair?
There's 54 seconds left.
I will be
Mr.
giving
Reid.
you the seconds. You have less than 1 minute left. I was just about to tell you until I was.
The same way that people have the ability to question the tenets of the Hindu faith, people have the ability to question the tenets of the Islamic faith. But when it descends into insults, threats, or even violence or a mosque shooting, that is what most people consider to be Islamophobic. The point that you raised about Petition 411, I found particularly offensive, I'll be candid with you, because 70,000 Canadians signed that petition, and you compared it to the theocratic gestures you found in other parts of the world. I think most Canadians would find that quite offensive, sir. And the fact that that petition received unanimous consent to be tabled in the Parliament means that I think most parliamentarians would find that offensive. And I would reiterate the fact that what Ms. Kwan raised, which is that what we are studying here is we're not targeting just one religion, although religions have been targeted in the past with previous motions.
15 seconds, Mr. Duran.
Such as when we identified the Coptics in need of particular protection, anti-Semitism in need of particular identification, and discrimination against the Yazidis. But what we're doing is we're also studying Indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-Jewish discrimination, which is, I think, an important part of this study.
Mr. Verma, I think your time is up. Thank you. Yes.
Just a point of order. Mr. Brownie's done this before, and it's too bad he wasn't a witness for us, of course, but we'd like to welcome or ask the gentleman if he would be willing to respond, the written response, so we can use that in our report. And I guess I'm a little concerned about the fact that, I don't know if Mr. Brownie's deliberately doing this or not, but it amounts almost to bullying witnesses, using his time to lecture them when they've come here at their time and effort.
Well,
so
if you would like
we've
to
seen
have a
this before.
response from our witness, then we have about a minute. And if we use it up debating with each other, we won't have that time. So
Well,
please
so
go ahead, Dr. Jaffa.
We've also let other witnesses know that they can send recommendations in. I
Yes.
appreciate if you'd let them know
Yes,
that as well.
well, you have a minute. I will give you a minute. And then I think if you have any recommendations you want to send along but in writing, please send it to the clerk of the committee. Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I'll try to respond as well as I can. First of all, while I appreciate the fact that the resolution is trying to approach all faiths, the bottom line is it was authored by MP Ikra Khalid under the premise of A411. There's nothing offensive about a Muslim telling you that in other countries that are not as free democracies as Canada and the United States, this same language is used to suppress any dissent from citizens in their country that said they aren't being put in prison for criticizing the president or the king, they're being put in prison for criticizing Islam. That is why it's called Islamophobia. And by you impugning Raheel Raza's work by saying that she appeared on this and that media rather than addressing the substance of what I've said, what she've said, I think proves the weakness of your argument, that you simply want to do the guilt by association, which you as a Muslim claim is bigotry, when in fact you want to do guilt by association in our work, which actually I think any focus on these things avoids. And I think the test of democracies and your free speech is not
Sir,
what...
I think your time is up.
If I can just finish this
Thank you
sentence.
very much.
The test of democracies... Okay.
Finish it quickly, please.
The test of
Your
democracies is not the center of what offends those who are kind and moderate. It's the peripheries that is the most offensive on the peripheries that test true free speech and democracies.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for being present here today. And we have now ended our first hour, so we have another group of witnesses coming in. And so I would like to, before I call this session to a close, I would like to suggest that we all need to think about the way we address witnesses. I would ask members to please consider that witnesses are here. They are indeed our guests, and I know this is a contentious issue, but we need to be very careful of our language, both with each other and to the witnesses. Thank you very much. So I now will suspend for the next hour.